Welcome back. You're watching Newsmaker Live on DBS with me, Kendall Burton. Our guest this evening, the political leader of the United Workers' Party, Mr. Alan Shastney. Before the break, we were talking about some of the changes that have you've taken the United Workers' Party through. I want to get a little more personal now. You've been criticized heavily for your qualifications as a leader of the party and your potential position as Prime Minister. I want you to tell me what qualifies you to hold either post.
Well, I think that when you look at my career, in terms of the things that I've participated in, my education and what I've achieved, I've always been at the head, so whether it was at Air Jamaica, whether it was at Windjammer Landing, whether it was at Island Outpost, and that the fact that I've gone back and forth between the public sector and the private sector in my entire life. But probably the most critical element is that my expertise has really been on either what we call startup companies or on things that are not working. So I'm a very process-driven person. So I believe that whether you're building a business, whether you're building an organization, that there is a methodology to do it. So it's the same way that a builder would go about building a house. You got to start with your foundation, and you've got to look at all the elements around you. So that is what my expertise really is. I'm an economist by training, and my whole life has always been about either St. Lucia or the Caribbean. I mean, that's what I've devoted myself to. I'm an individual that believes in distribution of wealth, and I think that because we have economic growth, if everyone doesn't benefit from it, then it's not really a success story. It has to be sustainable. And so the master's program that I did at American University was specifically designed with that in mind, because what had happened previously was the debt crisis in Latin America in the early 80s. And what the World Bank and a lot of other experts realized was that there was too much of an emphasis on the social aspect of it and not enough emphasis on the economic and the financial side of it. And it was, how do you marry that? So it's an MBA program combined with an economic development program. And then when you look at where all the organizations I've participated in, it's all been in that kind of framework. So from a background perspective, in terms of the party, I believe that I'm extremely well qualified. And I think that the results of what we've been able to achieve, my ability to be able to bring people together, to be able to communicate a concept, and to keep people on point. We can see a lot of people go to meetings, and they get very emotional, but it's not producing anything. So I'm very much of a person who believes, let's apply our energies on what's going to solve the problem. And let's clearly identify what the problem is. And more importantly, let us compartmentalize the problems. Sometimes if we allow ourselves to dump everything together, it seems overwhelming. And all of a sudden, when you start breaking it down to what the essentials are, it becomes much simpler. That is what I bring. And I think that those same assets will attribute very well to my ability to be able to lead this country. But I think that we're getting ahead of ourselves, because right now, my role has been to come in to help restructure the party. Okay? Once the party is restructured, and we now see a strong United Workers' Party, and where some of the older stalwarts, some of the people who used to support the party, and even some new people have come into the party, that we then will decide what the leadership is going to be. And that potentially could be me, but it could potentially be somebody else. And I'm absolutely prepared for that. So right now, I'm not focused on prime ministership of the country. I'm focused on restructuring the United Workers' Party. And I'm hoping that with the success of that, and as people get to know me better, that some of the concerns that some people have expressed may be answered themselves in terms of, wow, this guy can do it. But I clearly have a very clear idea in my mind what St. Lucia needs to do to succeed, and I'm very confident that plan can be executed successfully.
Let's talk about what St. Lucia needs to do to be successful. Today you had a press conference together with Guy Joseph, Ezekiel Joseph,
Spider Montude,
and yourself. You did a bit of a review of the government's performance over the last 2 years, having just celebrated the second anniversary in power. You used, and I say you as the panel at that press conference, some very strong language. Guy Joseph said, I'm paraphrasing here, that under the St. Lucia Labour Party government, St. Lucians are suffering untold hardship. Is that being overly dramatic, or is it a fair assessment of the government's performance?
I think it's a fair assessment, and the key is to understand why. You know, the recurrent deficit for the government was very high, so there is a clear need to be able to reduce that deficit, right? The World Bank and the IMF and CDB and everybody else, their prescription would be to cut back on your expenses. They don't believe that you can grow yourself out of that, particularly where the world is today. I tend to disagree with them a little bit in that, in absolute terms, and when I say absolute terms, when you look at the size of St. Lucia's economy relative to the rest of the world, we're like minuscule. So if I take it down to tourism, right, we have 117,000 US arrivals. Okay? Aruba, which is a smaller country, substantially uglier, but the same distance to the tri-state area as we are, gets over 600,000. Okay? Barbados, same proximity to the United Kingdom, they get 270,000 UK arrivals. We're getting 75,000. Okay? So when you go to like to Jamaica, Jamaica gets 2 million US arrivals. Now, the entire Caribbean is only 2% of the world tourism market. So the potential for growth is huge. And you can even if you're taking a little bit of business from other people, it can make a significant difference here. So in absolute terms, we do not need a lot to be able to grow, right? So the government came in and said, okay, they've got to be able to reduce the expenditure of government. So what we were doing is we maintained the subsidy on rice, flour, and sugar. There was tremendous amount of pressure for us to eliminate that. There was the subsidy on fuel. Okay, there was a lot of pressure to be able to remove that. There was the continuing maintaining of a water price that we had. Okay, and we had delayed the introduction of that. Now, all those were things that were being preached to us on a regular basis to be able to do. Our government felt that given that the world was in a recession and that we'd seen a slowdown in the economy, which was predominantly in the area of construction. So after 2008, 2009, all the major projects that were on the cards that had already started came to a halt. And it's important to understand that in some cases, it wasn't the developer who went bankrupt. In some cases, the banks who were lending the money went bankrupt. And people say, well, how come y'all couldn't get the projects back off the ground? Nobody was lending money. I mean, there was a worldwide financial crisis where literally the world came to a grinding halt financially for a 1.5 year period. So this government comes in and decides to implement VAT at the full leverage of 17%, eliminate the subsidy on rice, flour, and sugar, allow the water prices to go up, allow a greater fluctuation of the fuel prices. So all of a sudden, St. Lucians, those subsidies now were passed back to the St. Lucians. So it means that the disposable income, the money that people have in their hands, has been dramatically reduced. And in some cases, you can say now that it actually brought them into deficit. So people were either having to depend on families abroad or supplementing their income somewhere or changing their own lifestyle in order to be able to do that. And some people didn't really have a lifestyle to change. They were already at poverty level. We felt as a government that disposable income, or consumption, what we call it, is 30% of GDP. So it was important to maintain money in people's hands. The other thing was that there's no major social net here. When a person becomes unemployed, the drop between being employed and unemployed is a significant drop, because all of a sudden they have no money for anything. They don't have money for bus fares because we don't have a subsidized bus fare. It doesn't have a system where you can go and travel on the bus for free. You're not getting free medicine. You're not getting free school books. You can't send your child to school for free and to eat for free. So all these things cost money. Where is that money going to come from? So we felt, in the absence of a major social program, it was more important for government at this point to maintain those subsidies, to maintain a certain standard of living for the people, and hold on until we could see the economy coming. We felt it was more important to see a recovery in the economy first, so that as the economy was recovering, then you could slowly reduce on those subsidies. We also felt, and I felt, that if we were in power today, some of the things that we would have done would have been much more aggressive with regards to the incentive program, the incentive regime. We've seen now Grenada, Antigua, and Barbados employ that strategy. We have to try to develop the offshore financial services and look to see what are the successful countries in our region that have been able to do that, and what policies they have in place to be able to make that happen. And that government's construction of development programs had to be financed by new sources of revenue. So for instance, the airport project was being financed by the tax on the airline ticket, of which 95% of the people paying the price were foreigners. There are other forms of taxes, and in addition to that, there are what we call PPP programs, public sector, private sector programs, where government can put land in, government can vest that land into a company that's with private sector people. So it means a private sector person doesn't spend the money on purchasing the land, but brings money in to develop the project. So the Castries redevelopment is a classic example of that. WASCO is another potential of that, but we felt that the asset of WASCO should always be maintained on a local basis. But we cannot borrow money to do these developments that increase the debt of St. Lucia. Now, by improving the infrastructure in St. Lucia, you're making St. Lucia more competitive. And sometimes you have to see something and hear somebody talk about it to really understand what that means. So for instance, in Jamaica, when the government did the new roads between Montego Bay and Ocho Rios, and between Montego Bay and Negril, and they're now working on a road between Montego Bay and Kingston, a friend of mine who is in a fishing business said that his cost of transportation went down by almost 70%, because the maintenance of the vehicles went down, brake pads, etc. The consumption of fuel went down, and that he was then able to do more trips per day, and his overtime went down. So there's a significant impact on your economy when you improve your infrastructure. And I believe that St. Lucia is primed for that kind of investment. So what we're seeing the government attempt to do here is they've felt prey, in my mind, to what the World Bank, IDB, and everybody else has told them, and have passed on that to the people. And the people are not in a position to be able to absorb that. But simultaneously to that, we've not seen any form of investment in this country. So the big outcry right now is immediately when speculation was circulating that bus fares would go up, as an example. If bus fares go up, immediately people said, well, I need an increase in salaries. Okay, now, if in fact businesses are not doing well, how are they going to be able to give that salary? Now, if they're compelled to give that salary, what they're going to do is going to lay more people off. Okay? So idealistically, what you would like to see happen is that the businesses are being stimulated to grow. And in their growth, that the demand for labor would cause the prices of wages to go up in a natural way. And then it allows government to be able to collect more taxes. So we have some major problems. And I think the fundamental problem that we have in St. Lucia is our economy is too small for the infrastructure we're trying to maintain, both from a healthcare perspective, an education perspective, from a public safety perspective, and a physical infrastructure perspective. So I always like to use the example of St. Lucia has a population of 170,000 people. We have a GDP of just under $1 billion US. Barbados has a population of 270, 100,000 more, and their GDP is $4 billion US. And the Bahamas has a population of 370, 200,000 more, and they have a GDP of over $12 billion. Now, when you have a GDP of that size, the collection of taxes, all those things, there's substantially more. There's more money circulating. So in my opinion, and the discussions that we're starting to have in the United Workers' Party, is that we've got to focus on growth, but be extremely mindful of the social development of our country. But The world is not lending money. The world is not giving money unless they have confidence in what you're doing. And so you've got to get your economic situation sorted out. You've got to invest in your private sector because government cannot and does not have any more space. There's no more money that government can play with to invest in those things. And there are a lot of business people who are suggesting you today that government is crowding out the private sector. They're competing against the private sector. And therefore, you're not seeing the level of growth that you ought to be able to see.
Let's talk about VAT for a little bit. Some economists will argue VAT is neither blessed nor evil. It's a tool. Do you have an issue with the tool or who's wielding the tool? Because you did say that VAT was on the tables for the United Workers' Party, so it's a question of timing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we had, we'd held off and we were continuing to hold off. The difficulty I have with VAT, particularly in the scenario for St. Lucia, is that it was a new type of structured tax. So we've never had a sales tax here. So it was a complete startup for everybody. All right? When VAT was applied to goods, there was a trade-off, meaning that the government reduced the consumption tax and reduced the duties in the attempt to have it as neutral as possible. But when it came to services, it was a new tax. Right? And a lot of the services that we had were marginal. So all of a sudden, when they had to pay VAT on rent and they had to pay VAT on the other things, it just made their business unviable. So you saw barbershops and things just going and opening up in their homes instead of in rent. I think that I would have certainly liked to have seen VAT start at a lower rate, and to have seen VAT maybe limited to maybe trade goods initially, and allow VAT to be introduced into our economy in that way. So I think that we were committed to VAT. The delay in VAT really was the world economic situation and the impact it was having on St. Lucia. I think it's bad economic policy to want to put taxation or more taxation in a period in which there's a downturn in the economy. And at the same time, you're trying to say, I'm going to try to stimulate the private sector. Those two ends don't meet. So it really is just a matter of timing. And I've had a lot of debates with a lot of people because, I mean, for me on a personal basis, I would prefer a sales tax because I think that the burden on your wholesalers and retailers is too heavy because it's increasing their cost of operations. And and there's a very interesting thing that's happening in it. Again, it's a nuance that it's difficult for a lot of people to be able to appreciate. On one hand, we want a lot of products to be exempted from taxes, from VAT, in which the government boasts about the number of items. But it has a negative impact. So for instance, the interpretation that's being used here in St. Lucia is that if I run a shop and I have 30% of my items are VAT exempted, then I'm only allowed to claim back 70% of what I require in VAT. Now, when that happens, the business person then has to offset the overhead somewhere. So it means the cost of the other items all go up to be able to compensate that because the business can't afford to do that. So it has caused a certain level of inflation. And it's because I think that many people don't understand the difference between being VAT exempt and zero rated. When you're VAT exempt, you can't claim back any VAT. When you are zero rated, you don't pay any VAT, but you can claim back the VAT on your inputs. And so there's a subtlety to it that I think it's better to be understood. And I think a lot of businesses have been saying it's better to use zero rated or a minimal VAT number, particularly on products, than to go with the exempt formula. But I think that this is something that only when you get it started that these nuances come out, and we would hope to see that these things are rectified. But I think that I speak for a lot of people when I can say that I think that the government's response to problems has been slow and very defensive. I think the initial idea that anybody says anything critical, they take it as being a criticism or political criticism rather than just accepting, okay, look, there are going to be difficulties in starting anything new. But right now, the introduction of VAT has had a very severe impact on our economy.
VAT on medications. The government had indicated that they were going to set up a committee to look at VAT on medications, which you were invited to sit on. We had the Deputy or Acting Prime Minister last week, asked him about it, said the invitation was extended to you, never responded. You respond now.
I responded in the affirmative immediately. right? And what was indicated is that they would be putting a committee together, and they would announce when the first meeting. In fact, the first meeting was supposed to be the end of October. Here we are in December, and the meeting still has not been held. And remember, it did not only include VAT on medicine, but they said that they wanted to examine the cost of food, which, you know, anything that's going to improve the livelihoods and the ability of people to survive in St. Lucia today. As political leader and as a humanitarian, I'm absolutely prepared to participate.
Which was your response?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think it was an attempt to attack you personally, your family, which has been done?
Yeah, you know, there are many attempts, but I mean, those people who know me and know my family's history know that my involvement in the grocery store has been extremely minimal. I mean, Andre Chastney, who's my cousin, who a person I have a tremendous admiration for. We didn't grow up as close family members. I only met Andre actually the first time that my father took over Julian's. That's how far back. But I'm not really involved in the grocery store business. But I do know one thing, is that CFL is an incredibly well-run organization. And unlike what the speculation is, where people believe that my father is the owner of CFL. My father's a 30% shareholder in CFL. He is the largest single shareholder, but he is not by far the majority shareholder. And there are so many people who benefit from the work that CFL done. I mean, every day when I meet farmers, they come in, you know, really are so happy about the program that was implemented. I meet staff members who are there who now have shares. There was a gentleman who bought shares in the early days, retired, and sold his shares for $2 million. You know, so I think my father and Andre and the other shareholders are extremely proud of what CFL has been able to achieve.
You mentioned earlier that because of the economic situation, it's more difficult to get countries to give money. That is one of the arguments that has been presented by the government for getting involved in ALBA and Petrocaribe, two initiatives that you've had issues with. Let's look at ALBA, and specifically, what are your issues with ALBA? I know you've used ALBA or suggested that ALBA is responsible for the U.S. decision not to support local law enforcement and to end all training to the Royal St. Lucia Police Force. But what are specific issues that you have with St. Lucia's involvement with ALBA?
I think that we have to understand that ALBA and Petrocaribe are from the same country and same sort of membership, but are two different initiatives. Petrocaribe was started off, I believe it was either 2003, 2004. Yeah, well, a lot of people came together to the signature, but the idea of ALBA was introduced earlier. But I know that St. Lucia became a signatory to ALBA in 2005, and so did other countries. Now, I don't know why the then Dr. Anthony administration chose not to access ALBA, to access Petrocaribe. But we went down to Venezuela to a Petrocaribe meeting. We were invited, we attended, and it was reported back to us, and what was reported back to us, we didn't feel comfortable with it, because one of the conditions was that they could change the terms within 30 days. In addition to that, when we looked at the structure that we had here in St. Lucia, where Lucelec was purchasing their fuel, the existing companies we had, and how well that was working, we really didn't want to interfere with that process. So we chose not to go in the direction of Petrocaribe. So I was taken aback when I found out that the government had chosen to not only go with Petrocaribe, but all of a sudden to join ALBA. I heard the Honorable Philip Pierre indicate that ALBA is not a political agency. It is. That's all it is a political agency. It does give grant funds, but there is a quid pro. And I think that that's where there's been a bit of dishonesty by the government as it pertains to that. First of all, they never admitted that they became members of ALBA. It was finally announced by the ambassador of Venezuela here in St. Lucia. The issues I have with ALBA is that there's a bunch of conditionalities to ALBA which the government hasn't explained how it's going to meet. One is, how is it compatible with CARICOM? So some of the countries have chosen not to join ALBA because of that incompatibility. And I think that when Dominica first did it and everybody arose, there was a huge wrath of anger by a lot of the heads that Dominica would have done that without any consultation. I think that people turned a blind eye because they looked at the economic situation in Dominica and everybody kind of forgot it. Then, St. Vincent became a member. St. Vincent was kind of in the same boat. Antigua did it, and he only became a member of ALBA once Alan, what's his name, Stanford, had been imprisoned, and basically they were on the verge of a collapse. Right. So St. Lucia joins it, and what are the conditions? The conditions are that we must kick out USAID from our country. We must support the Falklands with Argentina over England, right? And that there are a bunch of other policies in it that are very questionable as to whether we can adopt those policies and still maintain our position with the US and the UK and even Canada. And the government has not answered those things. So, I mean, I would say it's questionable as to whether they should go with Petrocaribe, but given the financial situation, I can more appreciate that and be more sympathetic to that. But the ALBA one, I'm at a loss for. I really am. Now, in terms of ALBA being the cause for the U.S. pulling out support, I've always said that ALBA is a contributing factor, not the sole factor. I think that Dr. Anthony's decision not to go and meet Vice President Biden when he was in Trinidad, and instead go to Cuba for the 50th anniversary and to send the Honorable Philip Pierre. The second thing is that because you became members of ALBA, and this is where, again, the government is not being transparent. Because of being members of ALBA, their voting pattern to the UN changed. Now, coincidentally, the same voting pattern that exists in Antigua, Dominica, and St. Vincent, which are ALBA members, is what St. Lucia followed, versus St. Kitts and the other OECS countries and the other CARICOM countries were completely different from that. Now the U.S. is going to look at that. And one of the reasons why St. Lucia had received the aid in the first place is because we were a very reliable partner to the U.S. Not in everything they did, but when sometimes CARICOM would go against supporting the U.S., St. Lucia stood there alone and supported the U.S. And so the pilot projects were placed here. And so there was a form of quid pro. And it was very transparent that there was a form of quid pro. So if there's going to be a change, and there was such a dramatic announcement about this new foreign policy committee that was put together, and there was a new world order, I mean, I would have expected that the party would have come out and explained all those things and justified those things before they did them. But it's how we've been able to find out. And clearly that they've been doing things, and I have to say this, behind the back of St. Lucians. And now the consequential result of those actions, which they can't explain.
Now, you mentioned that you have no issues, well, I shouldn't say no issues, but your issues with ALBA and the same with Petrocaribe. But doesn't the government have a point or basis for getting involved with Petrocaribe? As you said yourself, traditional friends are not as generous. We're facing an economic crisis. Not many options open to us.
Look, I think it's an option that's available to a lot of people, and it's one that you would have to seriously consider. But the problem that you have now is this the time to be joining Petrocaribe? Because all the information coming out
now, when?
Well, the problem is that people don't believe that Petrocaribe is going to survive, because the economic situation in Venezuela is reached to the point that they can't even meet their own debts. Now, the sad part is that Venezuela is one of the wealthiest countries when it comes to oil reserves. But yet, it's one of the poorest countries. And when you look at some of the ratios, they're all at the bottom. And in fact, there was an incredible article or story that was done on the CNN by Fareed Zakari called "How to Ruin a Country." There's a recent article in The Economist. There was an AP story just 2 days ago that talked about that inflation's at 54%. The government has now resorted to nationalizing businesses in order to be able to sell products to people at a lower price. And that given the rate of inflation, given the continuing decline of the price of oil on the world market, and the potential that that price is going to continue to decline, that Venezuela may not be able to continue lending money under the same terms.
If it goes beyond below $75.
$80, we're in trouble, or they're in trouble. You saw recently Guatemala. Guatemala has pulled out of Petrocaribe, not even just ALBA, Petrocaribe, because the terms have changed. We've seen that Nicaragua, which was supposed to get something like $1 billion has only been able to get something like 400 million. So both the terms have changed and the quantum of money has changed. And then I think that philosophically, when I look at what is taking place in Venezuela, right, is that really what we want to associate ourselves with? And if the U.S. is going to start taking a harder line. Now, one of the other changes that took place that a lot of people have missed is that Hillary Clinton, when she stopped being the Secretary of State and Kerry took over, many people likened Hillary's reign as being laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means very hands-off approach. Kerry has come in with very clear policies and everything else. It's interesting that the U.S.'s decision to potentially attack Syria coincided with the decision to take a very hard stance down here. Do you really believe that the U.S. would have gone to war with Syria with underneath its belly countries that were making themselves open to Iranians, Syrians, and revolutionists? Okay? And could they have been a potential impact? And I know that I'm right because there was a piece of legislation that was proposed in Congress that would treat all ALBA countries as if they were Cuba, meaning stop visas, period. Why are we messing around with that right now? You know, I think that there are much easier ways to turn around the economy in St. Lucia. Let's focus on the right things. But where I think that the United Workers' Party very much differs from the Labour Party is the United Workers' Party believes in the private sector. We believe that the role of government is to regulate and to drive policy. We believe as a party that we need to ensure that people have access to a competitive education. We believe that people should have access to affordable healthcare system. We believe that people should have public safety. You should be free to walk around freely and be safe in your home. You should be able to leave your wife and your daughter in the house and nothing happens to them. And we believe there should be economic security. And we're establishing a lot of policies to support those mechanisms. But core to that is that you got to support the private sector. And we got to get the economy balanced, right? So it's difficult to see when people say, let's go and have an austerity program in the civil service. And you look at the number of people hired in the civil service that are nurses, policemen, and teachers. None of them are getting paid enough money. In fact, there's an argument that they should all get pay increases. And there isn't enough of them, right? But the amount of money that it's costing us as a percentage to our budget is a significant amount. The only way that you can now raise the level of expenditure is by growing your economy. And the only way to grow your economy that I believe is sustainable over a period of time is to allow your private sector to take that lead. And it's to identify what your core industries are and make sure that you're creating the policy environment and the physical environment to support that growth.
Okay, we're due for a break. Let's take that break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with the political leader of the United Workers' Party, Mr. Alan Shastny, our guest this evening. We'll be right back.